Hello everyone, my name is David Kosin and this is my final presentation for Cyber 200 Spring 2024. Today's presentation is going to be on freedom of association and assembly online. And a bit of an agenda. First, we're going to talk about Citroen's Cyber Civil Rights article that we all read earlier this semester, and this idea of a legal historical perspective. And while this presentation is not directly tied to cyber civil rights, it is heavily influenced by the framework that Citroen took. So I want to spend some time sort of setting the scene by relooking at this article again and what I mean by that framework. Then we're going to talk about why this conversation matters. We'll look at a brief case study with Occupy Wall Street, and why freedom of association and assembly online is a really important topic that needs to be talked about. Then we'll just go into some definitions real quick. What is the difference between association and assembly? We'll see that they're actually very intertwined and kind of hard to differentiate. Then we'll talk about freedom of association and assembly in the physical world, and then FOAA, how that differs in the online world and the various legal implications of that. And then where do we go from here? Now that we're kind of aware of these differences, similarities and differences between the physical and online realm, what do we do about that? So without further ado, let's dive in. Starting off, I want to briefly go over again Daniel Keats Citroen's Cyber Civil Rights. This was an article published in 2008, and it draws a comparison between online attackers and trolls to a history of anonymous mobs coming together to victimize and subjugate. And in the United States, there's a long history of these anonymous mobs coming together to attack minority groups. But what Citroen does is unique in that she draws a direct legal line between actions to combat civil rights abuse within the physical realm. So what have we done to actually push back against these anonymous mobs in the physical realm? This is commonly seen in things like the abolition of slavery and the civil rights movement. And taking that and translating it to the current situation online today. So we're seeing, again, a lot of anonymous mobs coming together to DDoS online platforms that they disagree with, or to spam with fake information, or attacking threats online that have genuine impacts on the creators of the content that's being attacked. And this is a really interesting perspective, for my opinion, because it provides us with a meaningful model to understand other rights and how they have changed with the internet. We can see that there is, a large comparison between the physical world and the online world. We're still all humans within both of those realms, but because of, subtle or not so subtle changes in the different format that things are communicated. So you're much more private online, you're much more anonymous, but communication is also more instant, and a single voice can be amplified much louder online. Because of these changes, we have to be giving the online realm a specific room to be specifically interpreted and treated as its own special thing, while still considering it in combination with the physical realm. So I wanted to focus on this because that's kind of the perspective that I'm going to adopt in this paper. We're going to try to draw, a legal line between the physical aspects of freedom of association and assembly to the new online aspects of freedom of association and assembly. So this then bears the question, why should we actually care about this? And I think why we should care is really captured in an article by John Inazu called Virtual Assembly, where he says that the line between our offline and our online groups is collapsing. This article was written in 2012, and I think that's only become even more obvious as the years have gone by. Our online and offline groups are very much one and the same at this point. We are constantly online, even when we are interacting with people in the physical realm. You have live streaming, you have the need to stop and post a picture of the food that we're eating. You have the idea of the metaverse, where it's specifically saying, let's make an almost physical-like realm within the cyberspace, or stuff like, what's it called? Virtual reality and augmented reality, where you're combining the two specifically together. So our groups are collapsing into one concept, and we need to understand the implications of that. A really good example of this combination of physical and online association and assembly is seen with the Occupy Wall Street movement in 2012. A quick refresher on that, this was a populist movement that was centralized in New York City, but really spanned across all of the United States and parts of the globe, the entire globe, that was looking at pushing back against corporate greed and the use of money in politics to influence politics. What's interesting about this movement is just how big of an online presence was also there. So in a paper, they found that over 1 million likes were given in support for the Facebook page about the Occupy Wall Street movement, and there were over 400 unique web pages made and engagement across all 50 states. This type of engagement just isn't really possible without the use of an online medium to connect everyone. And what's important is the way that the online medium was used. It was used for a couple different reasons. It was used for recruiting people and resources to local occupations. So there was a recruitment aspect of the online thing to get people engaged within the physical aspect of the protest and movement. There was information and storytelling. So this was just simply a way to spread the message as well, to find like-minded people to figure out, hey, what's going on with the movement right now? How can I help? How can I stay engaged, even if I'm not within the physical realms of a specific occupation? And there was a cross-group exchange going on of ideas. So we had people across many different states from many different backgrounds. So parts of different people of many different associations were able to assemble together in one larger, broader movement. And that's only possible because of that online aspect where communication can happen asynchronously and we can all be talking with each other regardless of, the physical space between us. So Occupy Wall Street really shows just how important the online aspect of association and assembly can be to the success and the impact of a movement. Basically, we associate and assemble online. It's pretty straightforward that that's what's happening and that that's not going to change anytime soon. And we need to understand legally what that entails and whether it is just as protected and loved as our freedom to do so in the physical realm, or if there are some real complications happening that need to be addressed now that it is online. So now that hopefully we've provided some motivation for why you should care about these topics, let's talk a little bit more about what we actually mean by association and assembly. And while I was researching these topics, I thought it would be relatively straightforward to differentiate the two, but you'll actually find the more you dig into them just how tight and intertwined they are. It's really hard to treat them in separation of one another. But we're going to try our best here. Starting off, we have association. So association is the right of individuals to interact with and organize among themselves to collectively express, promote, pursue, and defend common interests. This is a relatively straightforward definition. Examples of associations are everywhere. We're all part of different associations. This class can be considered an association. We share the common interest of cybersecurity, and we want to talk about the different political and legal and social implications of cybersecurity. And you can also have associations within associations. We are one cohesive association within this class, which is then part of a broader association of peoples within the cybersecurity master's program, which is then part of the broader association of UC Berkeley students. The other definition is with assembly, and this is the right to hold meetings, sit-ins, strikes, rallies, events, protests, and other related activities. And you can see almost immediately assembly has this more coming together aspect for a specific purpose. It's not just that we share common interests, but rather we are trying to address a specific topic. And because of this, assembly often has this degree of temporariness attached to it, of it has to be for a specific purpose for a specific amount of time. There's a lot of people would argue that there is no notion of a permanent assembly, but rather it is for just a specific thing to be addressed. But this gets really complicated the moment that we move it into the online realm because almost nothing online is temporary. There's always a permanent record of online interactions. And so this can maybe be kind of compared to the idea of someone taking meeting minutes during an assembly, but it feels a little bit more powerful than that, in that just because people aren't actively posting on something, it's still always there online. It's as if you can always still engage in the conversation and keep it going unless someone has closed up the thread and archived it. So assembly gets a little bit hazy when you think about it online. And then we see that these concepts are really intertwined, but there are still laws that govern them differently. And a perfect example of this is when we think about an online chat room. Is this an association? Is this an assembly? Or is it both? And I would argue that depending on your definition, it is both. It's definitely an association of we have individuals sharing some common interest. At the very least, they are all interested in talking to one another, but maybe they've come together in this chat room to talk about a specific topic. So they are associating with one another. But then there is also an assembly aspect. They're coming in together to talk about this topic and hold a specific meeting around it. So they've all chosen to engage with one another at this time to talk about the topic. It's not just that they share similar ideas, but they are choosing to engage and assemble together to address those ideas. But a chat room can last forever, forever in the online sense of the word. where I can always add another message to it, another message to it. There's no, okay, this chat, very rarely is a chat room just closed off and suddenly that's the end of the conversation, unless it was started for a specific purpose that was only temporary. But it feels almost disingenuous to consider a long-standing chat room to not be a form of assembly, because there's still active participation and engagement happening around a common idea. So you can see it is definitely an association. It's maybe an assembly, depending on how strict you are with temporary. But regardless, it is an important spot for people to express their beliefs and ideas, and so should probably be protected in a similar way to how we protect association and assembly in the physical world. So now let's talk about FOAA in the physical world and how we think about it from a legal perspective. As you are probably aware, it's a long-standing human right. It is emphasized in Article 20 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. It is broadly understood as a necessary and required human right. In the United States, the freedom of assembly is explicitly referenced in the US Constitution. You can find it in the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. And while association is not explicitly mentioned, it is viewed as an indispensable means of preserving other First Amendment freedoms. And there's Supreme Court cases to back up this claim. So it's essentially also a guaranteed right within the United States. And significant attention has been given to what actually constitutes offline assembly and association. So you have the idea of public meetings, you have sit-ins, you have marches. So it can be both a static thing and a thing that is in motion. And they're driven by intention and purpose. It can't just be any conglomeration of people in the same spot. There has to be purpose and meaning behind it. And that plays into whether this is viewed as something that is peaceful or whether this is something that is viewed as violent. If there is an assembly with violent intention, then it is no longer obviously a peaceful assembly, and so is not protected by these rights. But it's important to also think about what exactly does peaceful mean. So understand that peaceful does not technically mean legal. In fact, oftentimes peaceful things can often be illegal. So the idea of temporarily blocking traffic to make a statement. And from the Venice Commission in 2010, they say the peaceful intentions of the organizers and participants in an assembly should be presumed. So you have to go in with this idea that this is probably a peaceful assembly, even if I disagree with what is necessarily happening. And only once there is just cause and valid reason to believe it's no longer peaceful should an intervention occur. And this idea of peaceful but not necessarily legal is a little bit more straightforward in the physical world. You can think we have a very clear understanding of, for the most part at least, what our rights are, what is considered legal action within the physical world. I know that I can't physically harm people. I know that there's such things as trespassing and private property, but that gets very blurry once we move on to the online world, as we'll see in the next section. Now I'm going to touch on a number of differences and key points that pop up when we think about FOAA in the online world versus the physical world. And I'll try to provide examples for each of them as I go through here. The first one I'm going to touch on is the temporal and geographic differences between physical assembly and online assembly. I'm a human. I can only exist in one spot at any given time. Thus, when I am assembling in a physical space, I am pinpointed to that location. I am tied to that space that I am in where the assembly is taking place, and that impacts the way I interact with the assembly. If it's taking place, in a respectful religious environment, I'm going to be calm and respectful. If it's out on the streets and people are getting loud and rowdy, I'm probably going to join in and get loud and rowdy too. So it's greatly impacted by that physical location. And it's also only one spot in one specific locality. Whereas in the online world, I can have an assembly that is spanning across the entire globe. And a really good example of this is the use of hashtags. We can think of a hashtag as basically an identifier of one way to associate people who are choosing to be part of the same group, but then also an idea of like an assembly. When a hashtag goes viral, it is almost like people are gathering around this hashtag to take part in a conversation and to have a meeting about the topic that's being discussed. And we can see this with the Me Too movement. For those who need a reminder, the Me Too movement is a social movement that is pushing back and trying to raise awareness against sexual assault and sexual violence. And one of the major ways that this occurs is through the hashtag Me Too. At a certain point, this hashtag went completely viral. and was a major topic of conversation, and it involved people across the entire globe. So you have people who are banding together under this sort of shared hashtag flag of hashtag Me Too to share their stories and talk about what they've experienced to hopefully build some solidarity and raise awareness about this topic. So it's an association of people who are coming together with shared experiences, with like-minded ideas of how can we push back against sexual violence. But it's also an assembly when it became viral of people are choosing to actively participate, and it's sort of this fluid meeting that's in motion, but it's spanned across the entire globe. So it's not an assembly that's located in one place, but rather located in one online space, I guess, or actually a lot of online spaces. It went beyond just Twitter. And so it's just a cyber assembly almost. And that gets really complicated when we think about laws of association and assembly, because it's not just involving US citizens or citizens of one country. We have to take into account, what does the UN say about this? What do other countries say about this? How are different laws and restrictions in one country going to impact the other country and the way that the conversation develops? So you can see that the time aspect of it, this spanned it over several months, and the geographical nature of it make it really complicated to just say, oh, we can treat it like a physical assembly. The next major difference that we come across is that the impact is no longer closely linked to the amount of folks that are participating. In a physical assembly, if there are 20 people, it's very clear there are 20 people. If there are 200 people, oh, this is a larger gathering. And it grows and grows and grows. And we're really good at seeing that just by seeing how many people have assembled in this one spot. But that's really hard to do in the online world because, one, you have that temporal aspect of it, of not everyone's going to be there at the same time, but they're still engaging in the same conversation. But then you also have the idea of malicious actors, of I can make a bunch of bot accounts to make it look like there's a lot of people behind this movement or behind this anti-movement, and that actually the majority of people don't agree with what's happening, and I can shut down a movement that way just by myself and a bunch of bots. Or I can DDoS things. I have the power now to take down entire websites that are ran by large companies pretty much just by myself. Maybe, I hire out someone to do it, but the disruptive impact of online association and assembly greatly outweighs the impact based off of the number of people that are involved. It's no longer directly tied to the number of people involved, but there are ways to amplify a voice really, really loudly. And this can be great for some people who maybe you're in a really small minority and simply are not able to be heard if it's just based off of numbers. But it can also be really bad because that allows bad actors to push back against something they disagree with and silence potentially a large chunk of people just with their one single voice. So it's really hard to see that comparison of people involved versus impact of the association. We next get into the idea of what does active participation actually entail. It becomes rather blurry when we look at it online. In a physical assembly, if I'm there, if I'm talking and engaging in the group that's around me, I'm actively participating. It's pretty clear. But what exactly does it mean if I like a Facebook page that's part of a movement? Is that active participation, or is that more like a nod of the head towards someone? And it's not, this active participation element is really important when you think about, okay, what happens once a movement goes from peaceful to non-peaceful and there's time to actually, there's legal ramifications that occur and people might need to go to jail. Then if I've liked the page, am I now necessarily involved in the illegal aspects that they engaged with? Am I culpable for that? Or is a like just not enough for that to be considered active participation? The line's not exactly clear. Whereas with physical assembly and association, it can be pretty obvious a lot of the times. Next, we have this idea of how the public square has changed. Private companies often own the public square in cyberspace. And what I mean by this is the realm where people are associating and where they are assembling and talking about the things they care about are not publicly available comments. I can gather together in a town square and that's, part of the local city. I have the right to be in that space. But I am bounded by Facebook's rules and terms of agreement and Twitter's terms and rules of engagement that can necessarily impact the way that I engage and interact with people. And a really interesting example of this showed up during the Trump administration is Donald Trump's Twitter feed, and the comments on it considered a public space for engagement and conversation. And he would argue that no, he's a member on this account. But then there's the other idea of you are also a representative and the president of the United States at the time. People are going to talk in response to the things you do. This is a commentary on what you've done. And because you are such a public figure, this is no longer an individual space you get to share. But ultimately, Twitter is the one who sets the rules on that unless there is a court intervention happening. And it gets really fuzzy really, really fast. And then lastly is this idea that privacy is not guaranteed in the online world. I can physically assemble in a relatively private way. I have my home that I'm assuming is not going to be bugged and people won't be looking in. I can gather people there and I'm not going to be interrupted. Whereas online, it's really not clear who's watching all the time. This was made very obvious with the Snowden leaks of there's a lot of government espionage and snooping around that's happening. And so even though I may think I'm engaging in a private way online, I might not actually be doing that. And this makes it kind of difficult to say, okay, where is the line of, oh, I was just saying that in a private setting, I would never actually do that, versus, okay, you said this statement and now you were culpable for it because we saw it. But if you know who's watching, you behave in a different way. And that impacts the nature of the association and the nature of the assembly and meeting that you're engaging in. So we've talked a lot about freedom of association and assembly. We gave some definitions. We talked about how we characterize these freedoms in a physical realm and how they may be different in the cyber realm. And now I want to touch just a little bit on the legal implications of these differences and what we can actually do about it, what happens next. I hope it is obvious at this point that a one-to-one direct translation is not enough. FOIA online needs to be given specific attention. It is different enough both temporally, geographically, and privacy-wise, and so many other ways that if we don't give it special attention, then we are at risk of losing sort of the best parts that make association and assembly online really, really useful. And one of the major things that we're going to run into is the role of national security in this. So physical association and assembly have a really long-standing historical and legal precedent for being allowed. It's considered a major human rights violation to impact one's ability to physically associate and assemble. But that's not exactly the same in the online realm. We have a lot of nations that control people's access to the internet and have internet shutoff switches. And this is essentially the same as silencing a physical assembly, but because it's online, it's different. And it can be viewed as an issue of national security rather than a human rights violation. And the same applies with what we talked about of espionage and snooping. The government actors can be looking around at citizens' engagement online and how they are interacting with one another and do it under the guise of national security when that might not necessarily be the case, and it is in fact a human rights violation. So we really have to think about how do we want to balance that national security aspect of it versus our freedom to associate and engage in meaningful discourse with one another without fear of being attacked by those who are in power. And lastly, there is the idea of access. The public square in a physical sense is a place I can walk to and engage in, and I have a right to be there. But access to the internet is not always considered a right. There can be heavy restrictions on a nation's citizens' ability to get access to the internet, both from a political side of things as well as just a financial side of things. The internet can be expensive for a lot of people, but without the ability to talk and engage online, there's suddenly a huge dearth of conversation and meaningful engagement with other people that people just can't have anymore. And it almost comes to this idea of, should we be considering internet access a human right? And I'm not quite sure where I land on that personally. On the one hand, it seems a bit of a stretch to be calling that a human right, but more and more internet access is a necessity to engage in the conversations that are shaping the way our society acts. And so I can see the argument sort of for either side of it. Additionally, with regards to access, is for some people, the only option is to engage in the conversation online. For people that are stuck at home or simply too busy to go to a public space and assemble at a given time, sometimes the internet's the only way where they can engage with each other and with people that are like them. And so it becomes even more and more, not only from an access standpoint, but an accessibility standpoint. Sometimes that's the only option for people. So we got to always be keeping that in mind when we think about legally, how do we want to treat the new online public square? So what do we do about this? What happens next? I want to emphasize that it's frankly really, really complicated, but we need a nuanced perspective on this. The legal implications, a lot of us probably won't have direct impact on that. That's for policymakers and lawyers and all those fun folks. And that's simply not a lot of our expertise, but simply knowing about why it's so nuanced and why it's so complicated and being able to have those conversations ensures that it is not just a silent process by those in power to shape it how they want it to be shaped, but we can engage in that and say, hey, I think we need to be taking this idea into account. We need to be taking this idea into account. So I personally love the idea of online activism. It allows me to be a part of many conversations at the same time and actually, have my voice be heard and hear a lot of amazing other different perspectives. So engaging in the online aspect of association and assembly is sort of how we can ensure that it gets the attention that it needs. And then lastly, the internet spans national borders. So we always need to be taking a cross-border context into this. This is not just a question about US citizens. This is a question about our global society. We can't just say, oh, I have the right to this, so it's fine, and the situation is resolved until pretty much everyone in the world has the safe and able ability to associate and assemble in a way that's meaningful and impactful for them. We need to always be asking, how can we make this easier? How can we make this be better? How can we protect this more? That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you learned something from this, and I look forward to hearing all of your other presentations.